It's cold. The stone is cold. I'm at her grave. I'm not alone. Nothing to worry about. It's just a dream. Just when it seemed like Frank Miller was done with Daredevil, when Elektra Natchios had been permanently laid to rest, there came a resurrection. Beyond life, beyond love, beyond death, lies 1990's Elektra Lives Again. But with Frank Miller's Daredevil saga long complete and his definitive take on the character finished with Born Again, what else was there to say for the creator that permanently redefined the man without fear and gave him his greatest loss with the death of Elektra? Caught between a new beginning and an ending, between the constant cycle of Marvel Comics and a completed story, the result was a surreal graphic novel more about putting the past to rest than bringing back what was thought lost. Elektra Lives Again is the collision of Frank Miller's classic Daredevil with his mythic approach of The Dark Knight Returns, and his soon-to-follow evolution into the cartoonishly gritty Sin City. So why has this strange and powerful vision mostly been lost to time? It's a story of love lost, regained, and lost again in the search for grief's end in Elektra Lives Again. Now, I'm not entirely sure what a comic book is, but if you're familiar with my channel, then you might know that I'm a huge Daredevil fan. And to me, there's no greater Daredevil creator than Frank Miller. At the start of the 80s, Miller revolutionized the character of Daredevil in a run as writer and artist alongside collaborator Klaus Janson, which not only redefined Matt Murdock, but shot Miller into superstardom in comic books. But after only 32 issues, Miller was done, leaving the title behind in search of new work, but also completely overhauling the tone, style, and themes of Daredevil, while also adding in stylistic flourishes and new characters that would be a permanent part of the Man Without Fear's world for the next 4 decades. Most important among these additions were the Kingpin, a cast-off loser-villain character from Spider-Man turned into essentially the devil of Murdock's world, and Elektra, a former lover-turned-deadly assassin that comes back into Daredevil's life at the worst moment possible. There are a lot of small arcs and evolving character relationships that make up Miller's classic Daredevil run, and are part of why the entire story works so well, but it's really Elektra who defines these 30 issues as a cohesive story. Elektra comes into Matt's life as a deadly killer who reveals a secret part of his past, but now acts as a dangerous enemy in Act 1, goes on to team up with Daredevil against the newly introduced demonic forces of the Hand Ninja Clan in Act 2, and then is killed by Bullseye, dying in Matt's arms, a redeemed but tragic hero in Act 3. In the aftermath, Matt's grief sends him spiraling, eventually culminating in him saving her body from being resurrected by the Hand for their own evil purposes, and purifying her soul to help her move on to the afterlife. Frank Miller's story gives Matt some semblance of closure, but leaves both the ultimate fate of Elektra, seen in all white climbing an icy cliff in her final appearance, and Matt's existential crisis, somewhat ambiguous. Did the ritual actually bring Elektra back to life, or is this a vision of her spirit now at peace? Is Matt able to move forward with his life, or does his roulette confrontation with Bullseye put him on a darker path? Across the following decade, Miller would go on to create some of the most influential comic books of the 80s. In particular, the sci-fi ninja dystopia of Ronin, the brand new origin of the Caped Crusader in Batman Year One, and the future-set Batman Revolution of The Dark Knight Returns, all at DC Comics. And together, they helped define the new, grittier, darker approach to superheroes in the 80s. But Miller was never truly done with Daredevil, returning to Marvel again and again for new DD stories like Badlands, cool gritty one-off, Born Again, the definitive Daredevil comic, Love and War, weird story, and The Man Without Fear, essentially doing all of the Netflix Daredevil team's homework for them. With so many returns to the character, it's clear that Miller had plenty more to say about Daredevil, despite being done with his regular work on the title. But unlike Daredevil, the one character that Miller was hesitant to return to was that of Elektra. Now, I probably don't have to tell you that death doesn't mean all that much in the world of superhero comics, especially today. With hundreds and hundreds of stories of absolutely, no doubt about it, stone-cold dead heroes and villains miraculously returning to life for the 4th, 5th, 6th time because of magic, fake-outs, time travel, alternate dimensions, or anything else an editorial board can pull out of their collective butt to make a sale and make peace with readers. But even back in the 80s, Miller was already aware of just how cheap death was on the 4-color page, even for a character whose demise was designed to be a critical moment for a story even long after the creative team had left. I was pulled toward an inevitable climax, and she just plain had to die, which was quite a big and controversial decision, said Miller, which my editor Denny O'Neil simply said no to. And I said, well, why not? And he said, now look, Jim Shooter, Marvel editor-in-chief, won't let us do that. And I said, well, I just said it to you, so obviously nobody's asked him. And so I walked down to Shooter's office and I told Shooter the situation, and Shooter looked at me very sadly and he said, but she's more popular than him. And I said, yeah, but it's got to happen because otherwise she's going to be an insipid character, and it's so terrible. And he looked at me with sad eyes and he said, tell me a story, Frank. And I told him in detail the climax of the Elektra saga. And his face brightened and he said, this is great. We'll end it in a double-sized issue. And we did that, but I've got to admit the Shakespearean tension in the book felt like it was evaporating, and I felt my own interest started to slacken, and I started doing stories that were sometimes comedies and so on, and finally decided I'm not the guy for this job anymore, and it's time for new hands. And part of Miller's request in killing off Elektra was for Marvel to promise not to bring back the Assassin unless he wrote it. But despite killing her off, Miller was obviously not quite done with her. Just a few years later, and Miller would make the 8-issue miniseries Elektra Assassin, lasting from 1986 through 1987 with artist Bill Sienkiewicz. But in a lot of ways, it's not a true return for the character. Elektra Assassin takes place sometime before her death, has a very shaky connection to any previous story, as Elektra has psychic powers and fights the entire US government, and largely works as a frantic satire of the action genre. Demonic beasts in the form of politicians, a cyborg S.H.I.E.L.D. agent that falls in love with Elektra, tiny blue dwarves that run government operations, and an art style that is best described as Jackson Pollock on a gallon of acid. It's a perfectly sane story. Still, it really has nothing to do with the larger story that Miller was creating for Daredevil and Elektra in the years before and after, but it does show the style and direction that Miller was interested in heading in with his comic book work. So it's safe to say that by the time Miller created Elektra Lives Again, his style had rapidly evolved. It's not just that his pencil work has shifted into what is much more commonly associated with the craggy look of The Dark Knight Returns or the bristly sharp edges of Sin City. It's that what makes a Frank Miller story a Frank Miller story had shifted. Miller's claim to fame, and an element that would go on to define his entire career, is to use elements of film noir to ground comics that were once all about brightly colored spandex adventures in a dark, realistic world of petty crime and big personalities that still felt heightened just enough. This is Maltese Falcon, not Prisoners. Throw in the action of Japanese martial arts movies for extra flair, and you have classic Frank Miller. All that would become much stranger and more surreal starting with Ronin in 1983, and from then on, Miller would incorporate strange visions, non-sequitur characters, and increasingly odd, fantastical bits of world building alongside tortured noir heroes and femme fatales. Sin City is really this blend to its most extreme. Take a look at 1 or 2 pages and the super harsh black and white brutality of any story jumps out to you at first. Read the entire thing and it's the over-exaggerated cops, robbers, dolls, and guys that make Sin City into Sin City, with lucid drug trips, splashes of colors, and fantasy epics seeping in as the volumes of the comic go on. Your favorite version of Frank Miller may vary. I think that Born Again and Batman Year One are perfect comic books, but I can appreciate the many different tones and styles that he went for in the years afterward, even if they did tend to lean crazier and crazier as the decades went by. As for Elektra Lives Again, this is equal parts tortured self-reflection, surreal fantasy, and ninja epic, and well, it makes for a pretty weird comic. From early comic advertisements, it seems as if Miller had been planning to release Lives Again sometime in the mid-80s around the time of Dark Knight Returns. However, whether it was due to disagreements, delays, or DC quickly putting Miller to work on Batman Year One after the success of Returns, Lives Again wouldn't be published until 1990 under Marvel Comics' Epic Comics publishing line as a hardcover graphic novel. As for Epic Comics, this short-lived publishing imprint originally launched by Jim Shooter was designed to give creators more freedom in their own original stories disconnected from mainline Marvel. It also had the benefit of not adhering to the Comics Code Authority, allowing for more freedom in the stories that would otherwise not be approved, which explains all the blood, boobs, and dicks here. No, I can't show them to you here. Go look it up for yourself, you jerk. Set sometime between Roulette and Born Again, Elektra Lives Again tells a fairly small story that's intensely focused on the internal life of Matt Murdock and the seemingly supernatural resurrection of Elektra happening all around him. Spanning a week and a half and tracking from Monday, April 1st through Wednesday, April 10th, Miller's story begins with Matt seeking comfort in a Catholic confessional while still struggling with Elektra's death. At night, he dreams of Elektra in the snow, chased by the many people she's killed as an assassin, and ultimately torn apart by their mangled spirits. Meanwhile, the Hand seeks to hunt down Elektra, alive and in hiding. These two sides ultimately collide at a courthouse meeting with a Hand assassin who has murdered longtime Daredevil villain Bullseye, so that the Hand can resurrect him as a powerful weapon to kill Elektra once again. With our two former lovers drawn into another tragic battle to end this seemingly unkillable ninja cult. Unlike most of Miller's previous work on Daredevil and Batman, Lives Again has a very small, intimate scope, really only playing out in Matt's home, a church, a courthouse, and many ephemeral dreams and visions. But given that Miller never wanted Elektra to come back, and for so much of the story to live inside Matt's head, it's possible that almost all of Elektra Lives Again is actually a dream or fantasy. After all, it doesn't really fit in with the larger canon happening around the comic at the time, and presents a closed loop that allows the entire comic to be interpreted as either completely disposable, or really only valuable to the internal life of Matt Murdock. By the end, a resurrected and empowered Bullseye, you can tell because he's piping hot like a boss at the end of a beat-em-up fight, nearly kills Matt, only for Elektra to kill the villain at the cost of her own life. Dying once again in Matt's arms, our hero can finally accept his own grief and allow Elektra's spirit to be free and move on by himself. As a narrative, Lives Again feels a little underwhelming. All these years later, Elektra is finally alive again, but instead of giving her big moments with Daredevil or letting her own story have space within the book, she's almost entirely silent, and her own journey is only seen in glimpses. It definitely adds to the dreamlike quality of the story, but it also means both Matt and Elektra feel not fully formed as characters, and big moments like Bullseye's death or the final confrontation seem rushed. It's a book that works much better for people who have read Miller's previous Daredevil stories, as this becomes more of a capstone than its own thing. Lives Again clearly meant a lot to Miller. It's not just that he was involved in other projects, but he was deeply involved in every aspect of the creation of this comic. His then-wife and regular artistic collaborator Lynn Varley was colorist, he had his own brother Steve Miller do the lettering, and he worked with multiple editors that came and went over the years that this project was in progress to ensure that it got done to his exact specifications. Artistically, I think that Lives Again is a really visually striking, stylistically harsh comic. It's of a piece with Miller's work on Dark Knight Returns, but still feels like its own thing. Miller places the story in the midst of a surprise April snowstorm, and the prevailing color and visual theme is stark, unending white, with Varley's colors being much more muddy and subdued to highlight Matt's depression. That's an immediate callback to the final time we see Elektra in Miller's original Daredevil run, and here it blends the cold purgatory we see her in during Matt's dreams with the washed-out reality of New York. This is a cold, indifferent world that blends with the quiet purity of Elektra's afterlife, and it all feels like a desperate wish for peace from the torment of loss. Regarding layouts, Miller is working with a more square page for the hardcover and adopts a more formal approach of a 16-panel grid, similar to but more rigid than his Dark Knight Returns work. This allows Miller's story to be more detail-focused and to close in on specific character moments that feel a bit like a mosaic, appropriate for a story all about penance, purgatory, confession, and resurrection in a church twisted to demonic purposes. And when Miller breaks the format, it makes his larger panels or splash pages pop. It also means that action beats are a bit hard to follow. Miller isn't really interested in making his action flow here, but instead to capture specific moments that become collaged together for a more dreamlike, memory-focused approach. Honestly, the closest artistic comparison that struck me when reading was the later works of author Maurice Sendak, who would evolve from the round and lush figures of Where the Wild Things Are to much sketchier, heavier lines, squashed and stretched figures as his career progressed. The people in Miller's later comics are often ugly at first glance, with thoroughly creased fixed, anguished faces and rumpled clothes. Even his women, often meant to be beautiful, are harshly drawn, focusing more on their power or specific aspects of their sensuality rather than given an overt sexuality, with Elektra given a sense of power and control that no one else has, even though she must die again. Elektra Lives Again wouldn't be Miller's final Daredevil comic. That would come a few years later with the release of The Man Without Fear in 1993, closing the loop for Miller as he gave the character his new origin story. But this would be Miller's final dedicated Elektra story. And as Miller's recurring artistic motifs throughout Elektra Lives Again show us, this journey through Matt Murdock's grief isn't a loop, it's a spiral. For all its mystery, ninja action, and religious torment, this is a tale of letting go. In the end, Matt must once again release Elektra, and with her new death comes the return of the status quo. Did this really happen, or was it a dream? Is Elektra dead, or living a peaceful life? Miller's graphic novel is specifically choosing to not give any definitive answer because Miller wanted to maintain the fate of his character, while still being able to create a new story with her. Of course, this wouldn't be the last time we'd see Elektra. A few years later, Marvel decided to fully bring an alive Elektra back into the fold, with her return in D.G. Chichester's Fall from Grace. And from then on, Elektra has pretty much been a staple of not just Daredevil comics, where her relevance ebbs and flows depending on the writer, but Marvel Comics as a whole, with many different creative teams contributing completely original works with the character as the star of her own title, or as a major part of a group. Miller, quite vocally, has never been pleased with this, referring to himself as the father of Elektra, and displeased with having the character in both other comics as well as film and TV adaptations that are not written by him. On the other hand, writing for a publisher like Marvel or DC forfeits your creative ownership over a character, so I'm not surprised by Elektra's resurrection and am honestly a little shocked that it took as long as it did for the company to renege on their promise to Miller. On the other, I get why Miller was always so protective over his creation. Miller created very few new characters during his work on Daredevil, and even fewer that stuck around in any major capacity. The Hand is a faceless group of enemies meant more as an obstacle that I think never really worked all that well outside of Miller's work. Nuke is only in 2 issues of Born Again as a weapon of mass destruction, but Elektra is the embodiment of innocent love, innocence lost, and the grief of trying to move on with life after a devastating loss. In many ways, she's the most sentimental of any Miller character, and I think Lives Again really seals that emotional core to what she stands for in Daredevil's story. Bringing her back to be just another recurring piece of the comic removes some of that meaning as Miller's Elektra saga becomes a smaller and smaller fraction of her time. When looking back at his creation of the character, Miller said, "It was very adolescent. It came from a very adolescent state of mind, but I'm very proud of it." If Elektra Lives Again is speaking to one crucial human experience through all its violent, mystical action and hallucinations, it's that everyone must say goodbye and move on at some point. But that doesn't make it any less painful. He was right. The priest was right. "You must let go of her," he said. "She wasn't haunting me. I was haunting her. You must let go of her." The fire, even from across the street, it's blistering. But she's cold. She's someplace cold. Thanks for watching today's video, and happy Darecember, I suppose. Yes, I've gone and done another comic book video after quite a time away. And of course, it had to be Daredevil in December. Why did I do this? Well, I thought it would be a fun change of pace. And as you'll begin to see as this month goes on, every video that I'm doing is a callback to a type of video that I've often done in the past. What that means for future videos, you'll have to find out soon. While it's been a while since I've done a Daredevil video, Daredevil has been a very important part of my channel for many years. And a story that I never got around to covering in any fashion was Elektra Lives Again. So when I thought about doing another one, I thought this would be a perfect way to touch on the character again. And Elektra Lives Again is a very strange but effective piece of art. It's more of a hallucinatory poem than it is a superhero story. And really, Matt is only glimpsed in the Daredevil costume for a couple panels overall in this 70-page story. But I think it's really effective, and it's definitely one of Miller's stronger Daredevil works. It's not perfect, and it's not as good as something as Born Again, but I find it to be really fascinating. And if you haven't read it, hopefully this encourages you to check it out. It's also a really interesting piece of Frank Miller's evolution as a writer and artist. It's definitely closer to Sin City than it is to something like his original Daredevil run, but it's still its own thing, and I really appreciate the way that it blends a lot of his different worlds and styles in a single story. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Elektra Lives Again, and where you would rank it in Frank Miller's larger Daredevil epic. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons and members for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron or member, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive reviews. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and having a great Darecember.